we're going to talk about the relationship between theology and the political. Schmitt makes the point that in the chapter in which he really inquires, I think the third chapter is where he really kind of covers this most comprehensively from memory. He talks about the sociology of political concepts, which is what he's doing. He's saying we need to understand the metaphysical and theological beliefs of a people at a certain time to understand the basis through which they process political ideas. And out of that, we understand how they actually interact with the political, because theology is fundamentally the inquiry into what is sacred, and metaphysics into what is true, what is just, what is moral. And so if we understand how people inquire into these things, then, that's going to reflect itself in its political institutions. So Schmitt makes the point that when you have a kind of theistic paradigm, the divine right of kings and and Christendom in a kind of normal state, before the Enlightenment, the ontological category of the revelatory, what he calls the miracle, is preserved in the Christian theological understanding. So what this means is, in the Christian theological understanding, there are a set of rules governing how reality works. What God has spoken into existence, like the scholastics talked about this. Truth is, for the scholastics, a set of declarations made by God that we come into an understanding of. But there is also the capacity for God to act in the world, for God to come down into the world and show something new, say something new. That's why there's the necessity for prophets and spirituality and this genuine interaction with divinity. And so this legitimizes, I should say, sovereignty to actually act in the world. Because if God can show new things to us, that means that the truths aren't already understood based upon some set of dogmas and established ways of understanding that have already been detailed. There's actually a live, interactive, participatory aspect to what is true and legitimate and right. And so that authorizes monarchy. But then when you get the rise of the Freemasons and deism, this notion that God is just the divine architect, he's set the world into motion, set up a set of universal laws, the laws of physics, etc., and that's it. He just steps back and everything plays out, and God no longer interacts in the world. The ontological category of the revelatory is now removed from the theological and therefore kind of metaphysical understanding of the participants. And so now it becomes problematic for there to be a sovereign that comes in and actually makes decisions, because, wait a second, we need to measure the truth of what you're saying based upon some eternal set of static propositions that God brought into being with the origin of the universe. And so this sets the ball rolling to the problematization of someone actually making a decision and having the authority to do so at the top of the political process. And so you get, with the American Constitution, rights are given to us by our Creator, supposedly at the beginning of time or something. They're eternal, they're self-evident. And so there's no space under which someone can come along and say, well, maybe we should change this right, or we should change this law, or do this and violate these rights. That's it. This is the rules, and that there is no space for the revelatory remaining. Then as you get the progression of modernity with, deism becomes atheism, basically. God gets completely cut out, and you just have the laws of nature essentially suspended with no origin. So if you look at like the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, and then compare that to something like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, written around, I think, the end of the Second World War, there's no mention of God. These rights just somehow exist. They're just, and we've invented all these new ones as well. So now you've got the right to healthcare, I think, and you've got all these new. There's like so many more. So I don't know who. Like someone just decided apparently, but they were always true. These things are self-evident. And so this is the situation you get into with liberalism, where by removing the capacity for someone to actually decide upon what is sacred, you create this perpetual conversation or discussion that is supposed to have no actual conclusion. No one ever gets legislated by the discussion to finally to say, this is what's valuable, this is what's important, this is how society should be ordered. Instead, we just have this perpetual inquiry. But this goes along quite nicely with the what you get in modernity through Cartesian and Kantian metaphysics, where you get this transcendental subjectivity, this transcendental individual that can somehow exist outside of society and culture and come to rational evaluations about the world. And what that individual is supposed to do under liberalism is eventually realize that liberalism is correct. And so, because apparently if you just sit there and you rationally inquire, like a good Kantian, into morality, you realize that we need to have all of these liberal standards and so forth. And so this kind of perpetual discussionism conceals that a decision actually has been made by the liberal order, that we're going to be liberal and we're going to have freedom of speech and academic freedom, and we're going to have all of these things that we actually believe in, but we're going to pretend like this decision hasn't been made and create a perpetual discussion where you can talk about any other non-liberal idea you like, but you can't actually apply it. Because we can only have liberalism, because otherwise we wouldn't be free to think differently, you know? So that's the kind of residual, I think, basis from which we understand why I think Schmitt's so interesting and significant, and why I consider him to be a kind of the first genuinely post-liberal thinker in certain ways, because he excavates this idea of what he calls decisionism, this idea that sovereignty has to act in the world independent of pre-established ways of understanding. And this distinction he makes between the declarative propositions of dogmas, a set of already established metaphysical understandings, and actually engaging with being, the kind of direct, ostensive, imperative world in which there's a problem right before us, the state of exception. We don't know exactly, we haven't already got a pre-given set of laws and regulations and institutions that know what to do about this. I have to step in and make a decision. Point. This is what's important. This is what we need to do next. That's real sovereignty. And Schmitt is saying this needs to be understood at the center and origin of the political process. But what liberals do is try and completely remove, through sleight of hand and different intellectual confusions, that this is even a thing. There's just these eternal rules that are suspended, somehow they have no origin, that, the liberal jurist or, Kantian, neo-Kantian theorist or whatever can come into understanding through rational inquiry, and then those things govern everything. So the ANCAPs are a kind of vulgarized version of this one. The NAP is like this transcendental metaphysical,
universally preferable.
Yeah. This is what, a super sovereign construct, a reified abstraction, has no origin, governs everything, and all we need to do is just perpetually inquire into it, and then we can determine everything that we need to do. But of course, as a kind of segue to the next topic, Schmitt problematizes this by pointing out, well, okay, so who gets to decide how to interpret it?
Right.
How exactly are we supposed to figure out who's in charge of deciding whether this abstraction means this, that, or the other thing? That's the political contest, and ultimately that ends up leaving kind of open the idea, okay, well, it's all well and good if you think X, Y, Z is true and should be the way things are, but how do things actually become enforced? And this is the problem of sovereignty. There's also, I think, a point I wanted to re-emphasize, which is that Schmitt, kind of subtext, I think, that goes through all the works that I've read by him is this idea that I very deeply agree with, which is that there's a very fundamental equivalence between divinity and sovereignty. That what it means for something to be, let me rephrase that. The very center of our conception of what is sacred, what is true, is either, pick your poison, either someone that is, some kind of earthly authority, like a priest, a president, some kind of leader that commands on behalf of some political identity, some kind of conception of the sacred, or a kind of personalization or conceptualization of the sacred itself. There's something that gives us the authority with which to say, this is good, this is bad, this should be done, this shouldn't be done, this ought to be, this ought not to be. And so there's a very fundamental equivalence between divinity and sovereignty. And so you get with this rejection of divinity, at the same time, a rejection of sovereignty. So this hyper-atheistic trajectory in society has ultimately been a denial of sovereignty actually being a thing. You get with, that's what we're at with modernity, basically. Because that's the very ontology of this making a decision. You don't make a decision out of nothing. You make a decision inspired. What are you inspired by? You're inspired by divinity. And so the way that divinity actually comes into the world in a revelatory way is through someone making an inspired decision that something is before us, confronting us, that problematizes the way things are, and something needs to be done about it. This provocation of the divine and participation in its realization, that's sovereignty. That's what it really means. And I think that basic fundamental idea, I think, shrouds why we've gone down the trajectory of liberalism, because with Christianity, you get this alienation of the divine, where divinity isn't something, is kind of removed from direct experience through, there's a priesthood, there's a set of dogmas and theological kind of constructs that shroud what it means for God to exist. We look at so many attempts by various theological schools throughout history to say, well, don't worry about how God shows himself to you or about your participation in being. God is these set of dogmas and a bunch of nerds inquiring into scripture endlessly. This is what divinity actually is. And so we've been, that's why I make this point of the priest versus the shaman. We need this shamanic ontology, this understanding of divinity as something you participate in and you realize directly, because that's the grounding from which we can actually understand sovereignty correctly. And so once you kind of abstract the divine away in one way, or alienate ourselves from this imminent participation in divinity realizing itself, then you just start this historical ball rolling where it just gets further and further abstracted. More priests would set up more alienations to the point where sovereignty and divinity are denied as even having any kind of realness at all.